Okay, great. I've been given a thumbs up. Hi, everyone at LNUG. Hope you're all safe. This is Bernie. You can see me at BernieBear2000 on Twitter. And I'm here to do a presentation about authentication and serverless and Node. So just before we go into it, let's just have a little understanding about the three words that we've got on the screen. So we've got authentication, which is something we're all common with, the username, password. And then we've got serverless. Serverless is essentially a cloud-based technology which allows you to harness, technology in a way that's future-proof. It's on the cloud, it's distributed, it's blazing fast, and when you work with something called like a serverless function, which is what we're going to talk about in this talk as well, and essentially it's like spinning up a very small process, which is very efficient and very economical, for people to use and work with. And Node, we all know that that's something that you can program the back end with. And in the implementation that I've done, I've used Node, and I'm doing authentication, and I'm implementing serverless. So just a moment, and then we'll get started. So here's a little introduction. So first of all, you may be looking at the screen and thinking, okay, I know that, www, World Wide Web. But actually, in this instance, in this context, it's what, where, when. And basically, we're going to be looking at points that are going to be addressed in this talk. So we're going to cover some history. And you can flag it and say history boring, but like, I find history incredibly interesting, especially if related to technology. And then we're going to look at a problem which needed to be solved. And then we're going to look at the solution. And then we're going to look at how to code it. And I'm not going to be doing any live coding, but I am going to be showing you resources, and there'll be code snippets and examples. And this is presented on slides.com. If you've already come across slides.com, then I suggest you check it out. It's a great presentation tool for developers all around the world. So first of all, let's define authentication. So it's a Greek word, and it pretty much means to look at something, to say authenticus, and that's not how you pronounce it, but to say something is real or genuine. And being real or genuine from the authentis as being the author. But then if you look up a more recent definition of these words, then they differ somewhat. But at the time of writing, the words as to be defined authentication is broken down into these words. So the next thing we're planning to do is to solve a common problem for developers everywhere, anywhere, all over the world, which is two things, and we're talking about accessing resources. So essentially, when you look at a resource could be a page available at a URI, which is the identifier, or the URL, the location, and also API access. So essentially, when working with an API, you have protected resources and public resources, and you can just understand them as being a function which can be called, which is publicly available, but then also a function which only can be called by somebody who has been granted access or has privilege to use that particular function. And when working in serverless, essentially, when you work with serverless, there's a difference between your standard HTTPS server and when you're working inside the handler of a serverless function. So not to go into too much detail just yet, we'll do that later, and if you have any questions, I can answer them then. But what we're going to look at also is SFA, which is single factor authentication, and then MFA, which is multi-factor authentication. So just to give you a quick idea of the common problem again, it was speeding up the login and authentication of a user, let's say for an e-commerce website. And when looking at single factor authentication, essentially that's knowing something, so a fact such as a password. But then when you address multi-factor authentication, it's knowing more than one piece of information. So essentially, when you log into your Gmail account or as such, you predominantly will approach it with the username and password. And then if you implement multi-factor authentication, they may send a code to your mobile phone or as a backup, which is essentially having something that you know, such as a password, or for an ATM, a PIN combination, code words, a secret handshake, that sort of thing, thumbs up, fingers down, and anything that you can remember, and then you can type it in. And then also, when they do the multi-factor authentication and they send you a code, it's something that you have, which is your mobile phone in this instance. Or if you go a little bit further into the tech world, they have these what are called portable USB like firmware, which are used for multi-factor authentication, which is something you have and only that person has that key. It's a bit like having Bitcoin on a USB stick and that sort of thing like that. So then the second part of the MFA includes physical objects such as keys, a smartphone, or a USB drive, token devices, that sort of thing. And then there's another area of multi-factor authentication, which is something that you are. And that basically covers areas such as a fingerprint or a retina scan or facial recognition, which you all see currently available on new standard Android devices or iOS devices, that sort of thing. And also there's voice recognition. So now we're going to take a look at the history of authentication on the web. So if you don't know what a htpasswd is, essentially that was something that was used a very long time ago, still in use today, to pretty much secure pages that are available on the web, and it'd be like a simple username and password. And then more into the future, as we say, the present day, which is something as a standard on most websites, is HTTPS, which essentially means having a SSL certificate, which basically authenticates that the server that you are making the request to has been listed, registered, and they're not necessarily a fraudulent business in that respect. But we're not going to go deep into security and stuff like that. But that's what we're talking about with HTTPS. Then you have the OAuth, and OAuth is essentially an implementation and a protocol whereby security is implemented in many different ways. And you have JWT, and JWT relates and is understood as a JSON web token. And we'll look into more of that in a little bit. So first off, we're going to hit the htpasswd, and a little bit of the history on this. It's pretty much used to create and update a flat file, and a flat file is essentially a text file database. So if you've ever done like a CSV export from a database, that's a flat file database, and you can read and write into those. Like you can read a value, then you can register the tab or the space in a new line, and you can read your records, and you can pipe it and do all sorts of things on a command line with it. And you use it to store usernames and passwords, and it's for basic authentication on a HTTP connection in that respect. What we're looking at here, where you see bcrypt, essentially bcrypt is a encryption algorithm, and it's based on the blowfish cipher. And if you want to know what that is, then I suggest you grab hold of your keyboard, type it in, quickly look it up, and get a definition. And essentially, this algorithm is described in 4 simple steps, whereby you pretty much take a chunk of the password, you then run a logical operation against it, and then once you've done that, you then swap it onto the other side, and you sort of repeat the whole process. It gets really messy, and then you have a really heavily encrypted piece of information. And that's the easiest way to understand it. If you do want to look more into encryption, then there are different resources available on the web. And if you don't understand what XOR means, then essentially I believe that means exclusive OR, which is basically when you have like bit data, such as zeros and ones, it's sort of like swapping the values. So if it's a 0, it becomes a 1. If it's a 1, it becomes a 0. Then if you have like 8 of those, take 4 of them, swap them over to the right-hand side, do the whole process again, jumble up again. Then you have a encryption layer, and that level of encryption is sufficient in many cases, which was needed by HTPasswd. So a little bit of history on JWT. So JSON Web Tokens is essentially taken the JSON format, and then you take a payload of information, and the payload of information consists of what you see on the screen on the right-hand side on the encoded, where you have the header, and that includes the algorithm and the type of information that's being passed, such as JWT. You also have the payload, and when working with authentication, essentially the payload contains information such as the sub and the name and the IAT, and these pieces of information relate to the ID for the person, such as the subscriber, or the name of the person, or the time the token was issued at. So I believe the IAT is the issued at time. And then you have the token verification signature, which is in the blue underneath. And then obviously in there, in some implementations, you can see in black, you have your 256-bit secret that gets encoded. And the whole point of like bringing across something such as JWT was essentially to have a uniform way that a authoritative server could authorize somebody to do something, such as logging into a website. And then they basically wanted something that was interoperable, and they wanted a standard that could be measured. And also, as well as that, working with JSON is pretty much the way forward for data interchange on the web, especially when working with JavaScript and various other languages. For instance, Facebook, they recently announced the relaunch and the reprogramming of their Messenger application for iOS, and they use JSON heavily in that, and with the database to like have feature flags and different types of database schemas that need to be used, like flags for what features need to be used, all that sort of stuff. And it's really interesting, and if you want a link to it, I can send you one after the talk. So now we're going to look at OAuth, and then we're going to quickly glide through this, and I'm going to move on to the implementation and the solution and the problem. We're going to get away from the history. So pretty much this diagram that you're looking at here has a series of steps: A, B, C, D, E, and F. And essentially what those do is that it makes an authorization request for the resource owner, and then the authorization grant in step C goes to the authorization server. It returns a token, which is in step D. And then step E is where you use that access token to access something else on the resource server, such as an API call. And then F returns you the response from the protected resource, or the protected resource being a file. But that's essentially the flow, and it's really that simple. One of the things that I want to do in this talk is I want to get through this as simply as possible. So now we've covered the history, we're going to move on to some of the more interesting parts. So more recently, we're looking at passwordless. So passwordless authentication is essentially a type of authentication where you don't have to remember your username and your password. You essentially just need access to something that you already have set up with multi-factor authentication as such. And some people might say, well, what if you lose access to your email? Then there's the backup and you can get hold of that. What if someone gains access to your account? Well, then, you do take precautions against that sort of thing. So now we're going to move on to something else. So we've got a use case problem, and we want to quickly and securely provide an access to resources in a website and an API. So essentially, like, how can you go about doing that? And like, how can you break this statement down into something more tangible, such as a feature that needs to be programmed in Node or JavaScript or C or any other language, Python, for instance. So we want to look at logging into a website. So essentially, when you log into a website, you may come across it and you say, well, how do I log in, or how do I access a feature? So to give an example of this, I'm going to take you to a site, and then I'm going to type in something, and it's a public facing site, and then you basically want to do something or perform an action. And then in order to do something or perform that action, essentially what you need to do is that you need to be logged in. So for instance, we want to go in here, we want to buy this pair of cool trainers, and we want to buy it. So we try that, but it's asking you to log in. And the reason it's asking you to log in is because you're not an authenticated user. So now we're going to have a quick brief understanding of securing an API endpoint. So an API endpoint, for instance, that need to be secured is just basically a protected function. So then essentially we're thinking like, well, how and why would I protect the function? Well, in some cases when working with serverless, that's something you need to do. So now we're going to quickly cover the solution, so passwordless authentication. And in this, you can refer to OpenID Connect and the JWT RFC. So Open Connect is essentially a protocol which layers on top of the OAuth 2.0 protocol, and it's the identity layer. And what it does is that it allows you to verify an end user based on some authentication method. And a lot of security platforms that use this, and the one I use in this particular presentation, implement that. So then if you look at the JWT RFC, and if you've never come across an RFC, I suggest you do. They're incredibly interesting to read. And what they do is they outline the specification for any piece of technology. So if you want to learn about HTTPS and you want the whole geeky version of it, then go check out the HTTPS RFC, or for instance, the JWT RFC. So now we're going to take a quick look at Auth0 passwordless. Auth0 passwordless is basically an implementation of the technologies and standards that have been briefly described in this presentation and allow you to log in without using passwords. It's easy and secure. If you want to learn more about it, I suggest you go to auth0.com/passwordless. Now we're going to look at the implementation and how it's done. Now, we're going to skip over the boring bit, reading the documentation, which is what a lot of us don't do, read the documentation, which is I suggest everything that they do and you do is to read the documentation first. But we're going to jump straight into the code and look at the examples, and we're going to look at a diagram, for instance, and just so we can have an understanding of it. Okay, so apologies for that. It appears that we have a slight issue with the diagram. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go and hack the site. And there we go. So what we're looking at here is that this is a diagram of the Auth0 passwordless authentication flow. The user basically enters a code, the application calls the passwordless API, Auth0 authenticates it, returns back to the user, you redirect them to the protected resource or reload the page, that sort of thing. So now we're going to look at a couple of examples, and I'm going to run through the code and then I'm going to sum things up for you. So we've got a couple of simple examples, HTML, JSS, got a React.js and a Netlify serverless function. So here's an example of the Auth0 passwordless authentication flow, how to get it set up. Essentially, you just need a button, which can have any ID. You call in their script, and then you have a JavaScript tag in the page. And then you just pretty much implement passing your client ID and your domain. These are details that you get from your Auth0 account. And then you click the button and you show the dialog, and then Auth0 takes everything over from there and takes care of everything. So now we're going to look at a React.js example. So this is again JavaScript. And if you don't understand this, then I can talk to you about it after. But essentially, this is just JavaScript. It's React. It's ES6. You have hooks for state, that sort of thing. And this basically covers how to initialize the lock implementation, passing to it variables for configuration, and also how to store the access token and different actions that you would need to take. So now we're going to take a look at the serverless function. Now, when you're working with serverless and you're working with Node, essentially this is the nuts and bolts of how you will handle it on a Node server if you're not using Express and when you're working with serverless. So then when you look at the Auth0 implementation, essentially what they're looking at is that they provide you with an Auth0 package. But then what you really need is a couple of packages inside that library. So you need the JSON Web Token library, and you need the JWKS-RSA library. And if you look here, there's a link to netlify.com for functions and the handler method. And that basically explains to you a little bit more about writing serverless functions. And essentially what Netlify have done is they've taken AWS Lambda and they've packaged it up and made it simple, easy to use, and scalable, and just very effective and cost effective and efficient. So what we're looking at here is that we have a serverless function, and we're basically going into the serverless function. We are accessing the token, and then once we've accessed the token, we are setting up the options. We provide an audience and the algorithm, and the algorithm that we're providing here is a public and private key 256-bit algorithm for the handshake for authentication. And then you need to provide your well-known JSON token web keys, and then that's how they validate it. You also need to be able to get hold of the keys. You need to be able to verify the token, and you need to basically respond back to your calling application with a response. And you can see the different status codes, as you can see there, the 200 and everything's okay. And if there's an error, and you name it, if you want to pass back data. Essentially what you're looking at here for this implementation is this is an authentication layer. So pretty much what would happen here is this is simply verifying that the token has been issued from an authoritative server, and you're checking it by verifying it. Now that we've covered all of those things and you've seen the implementation of it and just how easy it is, I'm just going to ask you, which is pretty much what everybody would like right now, is to say, do you fancy a takeaway? So here's your takeaway. It's quick and easy to implement. It's reliable and broadly adopted, and it has a great level of community support. So if you do want to get started with Auth0, if you do want to get started with serverless, if you want to get started with passwordless authentication, or your regular traditional database authentication using a username and password, and you don't want to manage sessions, manage access keys, manage users, manage passwords, then this is a solution for you. Remember, the problem was quickly and effectively logging into an application, website, or accessing a resource. And the solution, in many cases, is to use a global technology provider set standards such as Auth0, and another one such as serverless, which is growing in the community if you don't already know it. And those resources are available there, and you can see the Auth0 link and the Netlify link. And if you need access to the slides, then I can provide them to you as well. So thanks very much. Oh, and just to give you a better idea of how this works, I thought I'd just jump on with this. So just bear with me a moment. So we're looking at, you've seen the code, you've seen it all, but let's see it in practice, okay? So then you go to this one, this website, and you've typed in what you're looking for, and it's now telling you that you need to log in. And you're saying, well, okay, so let's log in. So essentially, we're going to go here, we're going to click this button, and it's going to say, you know, provide your password. Now what's happened is that the authentication layer is pretty much asking you for the code. So we're going to go to the our email, which we have multi-factor authentication enabled for, and we're going to ask it, you know, what's the code, and then we're going to say, how can I like get that and like provide it back to the client-facing site, and then what can I do? So now here's the use case on the site, which is that it's a public-facing site. you don't need to create an account to use it, but you do need to authorize a transaction, and there needs to be a record of that, and that needs to be used for like marketing purposes for the people and the vendors who are selling items and that sort of thing. So now we've done that, we just come in back to the website, we hit the submit button, and it logs us back in, and then we're back on the site, and then you can go back, look, see what you were looking for, and you know, as this is a site in development, which you can see from the local host, I'm going to basically add a token to reload the product when it comes back from the redirect URL. But essentially, what we're looking at now is that you can purchase that item, and what that is a solution to the problem, which was a quick and easy method of authenticating somebody reliably and securely, and then providing access to a protected function on a serverless API, which basically is that after you purchase this and you hit the button to pay for it, then a record of transaction gets issued to the database, and that is pretty much covered and securely done via the API and the protected function implemented with Netlify. So thanks very much. I hope you enjoyed the talk.